Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the late-night streets of Philadelphia, where old loyalties hang heavy in the air and grudges never truly fade. This is the world of John Stanfa, a man shaped by rivalry and reputation, where respect was enforced through fear, alliances shifted in whispers, and every decision carried the weight of retaliation. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because it was fast or flashy, but because it meant living under constant pressure, knowing the past was never finished. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city fall quiet, and settle in as we ease into the tense, unforgiving story of John Stanfa. It always began the same way, with the soft hush of the city after dark, when the noise of the day finally loosened its grip and the streets seemed to breathe again. In those quiet hours, when streetlights painted the sidewalks in warm amber and windows glowed like distant stars, John Stanfa often felt as if the world was speaking in a language only night could teach. It was the perfect time for reflection, the perfect time for stories, and the perfect time for remembering how a boy from South Philadelphia learned to listen before he ever learned to lead. John grew up where row houses leaned shoulder to shoulder like old friends, where every stoop held a conversation and every corner had a history. The neighborhood had its own rhythm. Morning deliveries, afternoon laughter, evening arguments that always seemed to resolve themselves by dinner time. His parents believed in routine, in respect, in keeping your word. From them, he learned the importance of showing up when you said you would and standing still long enough to hear what others were really saying. Long before anyone noticed him, John noticed everything. As a boy, he was rarely the loudest in the room. He watched more than he spoke. He noticed which men shook hands warmly and which kept their palms guarded. He paid attention to who sat near whom at family gatherings, who told the stories, and who everyone else listened to when the stories were done. To John, people were like books, some easy to read, others written in quieter ink. He found comfort in the quiet ones. On summer nights, he would walk with friends beneath fire escapes and flickering signs, the air filled with the smell of bread from corner bakeries and the distant echo of radios through open windows. While others joked and rushed ahead, John lingered, absorbing the mood of each block. He learned early that neighborhoods had moods just like people did. Some welcomed you instantly, others made you earn your place. As he grew older, his world expanded beyond schoolyards and family tables. He worked small jobs, ran errands, helped where he could. But what truly shaped him were the conversations. Long, winding talks that stretched late into the night, filled with lessons about loyalty, patience, and the weight of reputation. John didn't chase attention. Attention somehow began to find him. People noticed he remembered details. A name mentioned once. A favor promised weeks ago. Problem shared in confidence. John carried these things carefully, like delicate glass in his pockets. He had a way of making others feel seen, and in communities built on trust, that mattered more than volume ever could. By his 20s, John had developed a quiet presence. He wasn't flashy. He preferred plain clothes, familiar places, routines that felt solid. He became someone people checked in with, not because he demanded it, but because conversations with him tended to settle things. Disagreements softened. Plans became clearer. He had a gift for seeing two sides of the same street. At night, when the city slowed, John often walked alone. He liked the feeling of being part of something larger yet moving unnoticed within it. He watched shop owners pull down gates, couples stroll arm in arm, old men sit outside late cafes nursing tiny cups of coffee. These moments grounded him. They reminded him that behind every headline, every rumor, every whispered story, there were ordinary lives unfolding in ordinary ways. Opportunities came gradually. Introductions led to invitations. Invitations led to responsibilities. John didn't rush any of it. He believed timing mattered. You didn't force doors open. You waited until someone on the other side recognized your knock. What people often misunderstood about him was his patience. They mistook it for hesitation. In truth, John was always working, measuring situations, weighing outcomes, storing impressions. He believed the loudest move was often the least effective one. The quieter approach, the one taken after listening long enough, usually carried farther. There were nights when he sat with older men who spoke of the past as if it were a living thing, something that could reach forward and tap you on the shoulder. They talked about mistakes that couldn't be undone and choices that still echoed. John listened, never interrupting, rarely judging. He learned that influence wasn't about being seen everywhere. It was about being remembered in the right moments. The city itself seemed to teach him. It showed him how roads crossed and uncrossed, how neighborhoods shifted, how one small change could ripple outward in unexpected ways. He learned that power, like traffic, flowed best when guided rather than blocked. As John's reputation grew, so did the number of people who sought his ear. He became a bridge between conversations that otherwise might never have met. He was careful with that role. He knew that being a bridge meant carrying weight from both sides. Still, he never lost his habit of walking at night. Even when his days grew fuller, he protected those quiet hours. They reminded him who he was before anyone else had opinions about it. They reminded him of the boy who stood at the edge of conversations, listening, learning the patterns of voices and footsteps. On one such night, as a breeze moved wrappers along the curb and the moon reflected faintly in puddles from an earlier rain, John paused beneath a street lamp. He realized how far he'd come from the stoops of his childhood, and how close he still felt to them. The same lessons guided him. Pay attention, keep your word, respect the unseen currents that move people together or apart. He didn't know then how many chapters still lay ahead, how many turning points waited quietly in unremarkable rooms. But he sensed that the calm he felt wasn't an ending. It was the deep breath before a longer story truly began. And as the city settled deeper into sleep, John Stanfa continued his walk, carrying with him a lifetime of observation, a growing network of trust, and the understanding that the most powerful stories rarely announce themselves. They unfold, step by careful step, in the soft light of ordinary nights. The nights after that began to feel different, as if the city itself were quietly testing him. John noticed how often familiar faces now nodded first, how conversations paused when he approached, not out of fear, but expectation. People had begun to associate him with steadiness. If something needed to be talked through, if a misunderstanding needed softening, someone would say, "Let John hear it," and John would listen the same way he always had, without hurry, without display. He spent more time in small back rooms of cafes and social clubs, places that smelled faintly of coffee, old wood, and stories that had been told too many times to count. The lights were never bright in those rooms. They didn't need to be. They were spaces for voices, for subtle expressions, for the kind of exchanges that happened best when no one felt on stage. John felt at ease there. He had learned long ago that people reveal more when they aren't performing. What struck him most was how rarely anyone spoke in straight lines. Conversations curved. They drifted from family to business, from memories to plans, from worries to hopes. John followed every turn. He understood that what someone said first was often not what mattered most. So he waited. He let silence stretch. Eventually, the real concern always surfaced, like a tide finding its natural level. He became known for remembering, not just names but moments. A sick aunt, a son struggling in school, a shop owner worried about a lease. Weeks later, he would ask about them casually, sincerely. Those small recognitions built something stronger than any promise. People felt anchored around him. At home, his routines remained simple. Early mornings, quiet meals, evenings that often began with nothing more. Ambitious than a walk. Yet his phone rang more often now. Not urgently, not dramatically, just steadily. Each call another thread tying him into the wider fabric of the city's life. Sometimes he met men who carried themselves with loud confidence, voices filling rooms before they did. John never competed with that. He let them speak. He watched how others reacted. He noticed whose jokes landed and whose stories felt rehearsed. He learned to distinguish between presence and noise. One evening, He found himself seated beside an older man who had seen several eras of the neighborhood rise and fade. The man stirred sugar into his coffee and said, almost to himself, "You remind me of the guys who lasted." John didn't ask what he meant. He already understood. The ones who lasted were the ones who didn't confuse attention for stability. As weeks became months, John's world quietly widened. Introductions now crossed neighborhoods. He heard about opportunities that had nothing to do with where he'd started. He listened to people describe ambitions bigger than a single block or a single circle. And still, he approached everything the same way. Slowly, thoughtfully, as if each new connection were a book he intended to read fully, not skim. Yet with growth came tension. He sensed it before anyone named it. Small shifts in tone, pauses where there hadn't been any, questions phrased too carefully. The city, he realized, was never static. It was a living conversation, and conversations changed. One night, walking home beneath a sky blurred by low clouds, he passed a group of young men laughing loudly, full of momentum and plans. He saw himself in them years earlier. He also saw the uncertainty they didn't yet recognize. He felt a quiet responsibility, not to lead them, not to shape them, but to remember that every confident stride once began as an unsteady step. At another cafe, a discussion stretched long past midnight. Different perspectives, overlapping interests, careful words. John said little, but when he did, the room leaned in. He had learned the power of speaking last, of letting every voice spend itself before offering something that gathered them together. His words were rarely dramatic. They were clarifying, and people appreciated clarity. Afterward, walking back through near-empty streets, he reflected on how far the simple act of listening had carried him. He had never planned to be at the center of so many exchanges. He had only planned to pay attention. Yet here he was, part of discussions that felt like crossroads. Still, he guarded something precious, his inner quiet. On nights when the city felt heavy, he returned to the routines that had shaped him. He brewed tea. He read. He stood by the window and watched headlights slide past like slow-moving stars. These moments reminded him that identity wasn't granted by others. It was something you maintained. In those quiet hours, he also acknowledged the unease that accompanied growth. More connections meant more expectations. More expectations meant more delicate balances. John didn't fear this, but he respected it. Balance, he knew, required constant attention. You didn't achieve it once and keep it forever. You practiced it. And so he continued, step by deliberate step, weaving his way through conversations, relationships, and shifting circumstances. The city around him seemed unchanged to casual eyes. Same streets, same storefronts, same rhythms. But John felt the deeper movement underneath, like a current beneath a calm surface. He sensed that the chapters ahead would test what he had learned. Listening would no longer be enough. Understanding would need to become guidance. Observation would need to become decision. But for now, as another night settled over South Philadelphia, he allowed himself a rare smile. The boy who once lingered at the edges of conversations had become someone conversations quietly gathered around. And the story, he knew, was only beginning to open. The first real test came without announcement, the way most important moments do. It arrived disguised as an ordinary evening, the kind John might have once walked through without a second thought. A soft rain had passed earlier, leaving the sidewalks dark and reflective. Neon signs shimmered in the puddles, and the city felt hushed, as though it were listening to itself. John was invited to sit in on a conversation that, on the surface, sounded routine. A few familiar faces, a quiet room, coffee poured, chairs pulled close. But the tone was different. Words were chosen more carefully. Glances lingered longer. Beneath the casual greetings was something unspoken, a shared awareness that this wasn't just another exchange of stories. They talked about overlapping interests, about how paths crossed and sometimes tangled, about how misunderstandings, left alone, had a way of growing larger than they deserved to be. Everyone spoke, and as always, John listened. He noticed the small details. The way one man kept tapping his finger against the rim of his cup, the way another leaned back whenever a certain name was mentioned. These gestures spoke more clearly than any sentence. When the room finally grew quiet, all eyes drifted toward him, not abruptly, gently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. John felt the familiar stillness settle in him. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it breathe. Then he spoke. Not with solutions, not with declarations, but with a reflection. He repeated what he had heard, calmly, accurately, without judgment. He named the concerns without sharpening them. He acknowledged the tensions without dramatizing them. Something in the room softened. People began responding not to each other's positions, but to the shared picture John had quietly drawn. The conversation shifted. Where there had been edges, there were now angles. Where there had been tension, there was curiosity. That night, as he walked home, John realized something subtle but profound had changed. He was no longer just someone people spoke to. He was someone people spoke through. A translator of perspectives. A mirror that helped others see themselves more clearly. With that realization came a deeper weight. Being trusted to listen was one thing. Being trusted to shape understanding was another. In the days that followed, his calendar filled in ways it never had before. Short meetings, long walks, late coffees, conversations that drifted from the practical to the philosophical. People didn't always know exactly what they wanted from him. Often, they just knew they wanted him there. John made a point of staying grounded. He still visited the same bakeries, still took the same evening walks, still stopped to talk with neighbors who cared nothing for quiet rooms or layered conversations. They asked about his family, about the weather, about the state of the local baseball team. Those simple exchanges reminded him that no matter how intricate life became, it was built from ordinary moments. One afternoon, he visited a small park where he had once spent long hours as a teenager, sitting on a bench with friends, dreaming without definitions. He watched children now chase pigeons across the grass, their laughter cutting cleanly through the air. He thought about how ambition often grew from those same open places, before it learned the language of plans and consequences. As his role subtly expanded, John also became more aware of perception. How stories traveled, how a name, once spoken in enough rooms, began to carry meanings you never personally attached to it. He was careful with that. He corrected exaggerations when he heard them. He redirected praise when it became too heavy. He believed identity should be something you inhabited, not something that chased you. There were evenings when conversations stretched long into the night, when fatigue pressed against his eyes but his attention never wandered. He found that people often revealed their most important thoughts when they were tired enough to stop guarding them. Those moments demanded respect. John treated them gently. On one such night, after a particularly layered discussion, he stepped outside alone. The street was nearly empty. A bus passed in the distance, its windows glowing like a moving row of rooms. He inhaled the cool air and felt the familiar calm return. No matter how many voices he carried with him, he needed these solitary pauses to sort them, to understand where they belonged. He began keeping a small notebook, not of names or plans, but of impressions. Phrases people used, patterns he noticed, questions that lingered. It wasn't a record of events. It was a map of understanding. Over time, he saw themes emerge. Desires for stability, fears of being overlooked, hopes for recognition, worries about change. Different words, same currents. John came to see that many conflicts weren't truly about outcomes. They were about identity, about how people wanted to be seen. Once he recognized that, conversations opened in new ways. He learned to ask not just, "What do you want?" but, "What does this represent to you?" And people answered. The city, too, seemed to respond differently. Familiar streets now felt layered, as if beneath each storefront lay another invisible city made of relationships and histories. John walked through it with growing awareness, careful not to step too heavily on what couldn't be seen. Late one night, sitting by his window, he watched rain return, tracing thin lines down the glass. He thought about how water shaped stone not through force, but through consistency. The thought stayed with him. He understood now that whatever direction his story took, It would not be defined by single moments, but by accumulation. By the way one conversation prepared the ground for the next. By the way patience slowly carved clarity. He closed his notebook and leaned back, listening to the rain, and the distant traffic merge into a soft, steady sound. He felt no urgency, no need to rush what was unfolding. He sensed that the path ahead would ask more of him. Not louder words, but deeper presence. And as sleep finally edged closer, John Stanfa rested in the knowledge that his life had become what he had always practiced. An ongoing conversation, unfolding in the quiet spaces between voices. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow, steady melody. Nothing dramatic on the surface, no single moment anyone would point to and say, "That's when it changed." And yet, everything was changing. John felt it in the way invitations came now. Not casual, not last minute, but considered. People planned around his presence. They wanted his timing, his thoughts, his sense of how things might land if spoken one way instead of another. He had become, quietly, a kind of anchor. He spent more afternoons walking instead of sitting. Movement helped him think. He passed through neighborhoods that felt like different worlds stitched together by streets and bus lines. Each had its own pace. Some hurried, some lingered. John matched them instinctively. He believed understanding a place required moving at its speed. One evening, he met with two groups who rarely shared the same air. The room was neutral, chosen carefully.
No familiar walls. No territorial confort.
Just a table, warm light, and the faint hum of traffic beyond the windows. At first, the conversation stayed polite, almost formal. People spoke in generalities. They smiled without warmth. John let it unfold. He noticed the way both sides described the same challenges with different words. One spoke of respect, the other of stability. One spoke of tradition, the other of opportunity. To him, they sounded less like opposites and more like two hands describing the same object from different sides. When he finally spoke, he didn't offer solutions. He offered translation. He reflected their words back in a way that revealed the shared ground beneath them. He pointed gently to where their concerns overlapped, where their goals echoed each other. As he spoke, something shifted. Shoulders lowered, faces softened. People began addressing each other instead of the air between them. The meeting ended without grand conclusions.
No announcements. No declarations.
Just a sense that something had been set in motion. John left knowing that sometimes progress wasn't about agreement. It was about recognition. Later that night, he walked alone again, hands in his pockets, collar turned up against a cool breeze. The city lights shimmered in the windows of closed shops. He felt tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from attention fully given. He thought about how different his life looked from the outside now compared to how it felt from within. Others might have described momentum. John experienced it more as balance, a careful placing of each step. At home, he brewed tea and sat by the window. He let the quiet settle. He had learned not to fill silence too quickly. Silence, he believed, was where understanding often finished forming. His phone buzzed once, then again. Messages of thanks, of appreciation, of simple acknowledgement. He didn't answer immediately. He waited until the tea had cooled, until his thoughts had slowed enough to move cleanly into words. He responded briefly, warmly, without ceremony. Over the next days, more people sought him out not just for guidance, but for reassurance. Change, he realized, unsettled even those who wanted it. They didn't always need direction. Sometimes they needed steadiness. Someone who reminded them that not every movement meant collapse. John made a point of staying visible in ordinary places. The corner cafe, the bakery, the small park. He spoke with people who had no interest in layered conversations or quiet rooms. They talked about weather, about rising prices, about how quickly children grew. Those talks mattered, just as much. They kept his sense of proportion intact. One afternoon, an old neighbor stopped him on the sidewalk. She had known him since he was small. She looked at him for a long moment before smiling. "You still walk the same way," she said, "like you're listening to the ground." The words stayed with him. That night, as he lay awake, He considered how easily a person could drift from themselves when others began projecting stories onto them. He didn't want to become an echo of expectation. He wanted to remain an origin of attention. He wrote in his notebook again, not about people this time, but about himself, about what steadiness felt like, about what he wanted his presence to offer. Calm, clarity, room for others to think. Days layered onto days. Conversations overlapped. Some led somewhere. Some simply settled something that had been restless. John didn't measure success in outcomes. He measured it in tone, in the difference between a room that felt tight and one that felt breathable. He sensed, though, that not all paths ahead would be this smooth. The city's rhythms always changed eventually. New patterns would test old understandings. He didn't fear that. He welcomed it in the way a careful person welcomes weather, by preparing rather than denying. On another late walk, he paused at an intersection where four neighborhoods quietly met. He watched the light change. He listened to the distant sound of a train moving somewhere beneath the streets. He felt the vast, intricate network of lives unfolding around him, intersecting in ways no single person could fully map. And he knew his role within it was not to control the flow, but to notice it, respect it, and, when asked, help it move a little more smoothly. As he turned and continued home, footsteps soft on the pavement, John Stanfa carried with him not a sense of arrival, but a deepening awareness of responsibility. His story was not becoming louder. It was becoming wider. By the time autumn settled fully over the city, John began to feel the change not just in the air, but in the undercurrent of his days. Leaves gathered in corners like quiet secrets. The light thinned earlier each evening. Conversations, too, seemed to arrive wearing heavier coats. People spoke more carefully now, more thoughtfully, as if they sensed that whatever they were building together was entering a more delicate phase. John noticed that fewer meetings were about introductions. Most were about alignment. He was often asked not only what he thought, but how he felt about the direction things were taking. That difference mattered to him. Opinions could be borrowed. Feelings had to be lived. One afternoon, he sat with a small group in a quiet back room while rain traced slow lines down the window. The talk moved from practical concerns into deeper waters. Trust, continuity, the challenge of guiding many voices without losing the thread that connected them. As each person spoke, John felt the familiar responsibility of holding the space without claiming it. When they turned to him, he chose his words slowly. He spoke about the danger of mistaking motion for progress, about how easy it was to create activity without meaning. He reminded them that the strongest structures were often invisible, the understandings, the shared values, the quiet agreements about how people wish to treat one another. You can build anything, he said gently, but what you build it on decides how long it stands. No one interrupted. The room felt still but not heavy, more like a held breath. Afterward, one of the men walked with him partway down the block. They spoke about childhood streets, about how different the city felt when you were small enough to think a few blocks made up the whole world. When they parted, the man clasped John's shoulder briefly, a wordless acknowledgement that said more than thanks. Moments like that stayed with him, yet not all encounters were so simple. As his presence became more central, John began to feel the edges of differing expectations. Some people wanted certainty, others wanted speed. A few wanted reassurance that nothing would change at all. John understood that these desires often contradicted each other. His task was not to satisfy them, but to navigate them without losing his own compass. He returned more often to his notebook, not because he needed to remember, but because he needed to clarify. He wrote about the tension between patience and momentum, about the difference between guiding and directing, about how easily a person could confuse influence with identity. At home, he rearranged little things, moved a chair, cleared a shelf. These small acts of order helped him feel the larger ones more clearly. He cooked more, took longer walks. He believed that if your inner life became rushed, your outer choices soon followed. One evening, after a long day of layered conversations, he walked to a river overlook where he sometimes went to think. The water moved steadily, reflecting scattered lights from the opposite shore. Watching it, he felt the familiar metaphor settle in his mind. The river didn't argue with obstacles. It shaped itself around them. It remained itself without insisting on one shape. He realized then that what people most often brought to him wasn't problems. It was uncertainty. They didn't know how to hold what they had while preparing for what was coming. John couldn't remove that uncertainty, but he could sit with it. And sometimes, sitting with something was what allowed it to soften. The following weeks were full of such moments. A conversation that began tense but ended thoughtful. A disagreement that didn't dissolve, but learned to breathe. A plan that changed shape not because it failed, but because it understood itself better. John didn't announce any of this. He simply stayed present within it. He still found time to visit his family, to sit at tables where the talk was about recipes and memories, not direction and alignment. These gatherings grounded him. They reminded him that life was not made only of crossroads, but also of kitchens, laughter, and familiar arguments that never truly needed resolving. One night, after such a visit, he walked home through streets washed clean by an earlier rain. The sky had cleared, and a few stars showed faintly above the glow of the city. He thought about how many paths were converging through him now, and how important it was not to let any single one claim the whole of who he was. He paused at a corner he had crossed 1,000 times. The light changed. He didn't move right away. He stood there a moment longer, feeling the quiet certainty that came not from knowing what would happen next, but from trusting how he would meet it. Whatever chapters were approaching, he knew they would not ask him to become someone else. They would ask him to become more fully who he already was. And so he stepped forward again, coat pulled closer, breath rising softly in the cool air, carrying with him the steady awareness that his story was no longer just about listening. It was about holding. By the time the late autumn winds swept through the city, John found himself navigating a rhythm of life he had never fully anticipated. The quiet rooms and layered conversations had become a kind of terrain he now knew intimately, a landscape of understanding that required more patience than action. People came to him with questions, concerns, subtle tensions that could not be resolved with a single word. And more often than not, he discovered that the solution wasn't a solution at all. It was the careful unfolding of understanding, one step at a time. He spent entire mornings walking streets he had once only passed in haste, observing the unnoticed details of daily life. The way a shopkeeper arranged the morning display, the way a bus driver nodded to a familiar passenger, the soft laughter of children chasing pigeons in the park. Each small observation fed into his awareness, reminding him that even in the most complex layers of negotiation or leadership, the ordinary moments mattered. They were the threads that kept the broader tapestry from unraveling. At one meeting, a disagreement arose that could have escalated quickly. Two people he respected were at odds over a project that touched multiple lives and legacies. John didn't speak immediately. He let the room breathe, allowing the silence to stretch and stretch until the tension became almost audible. Then, when the moment was ripe, he spoke, not to impose a solution, but to reflect what each party had expressed in their own words. "What I hear," he began gently, "is that both of you want stability. Both of you want this work to honor what has come before, while moving forward responsibly. You are describing the same goal in different languages." It was a simple act, almost a translation, but the effect was profound. Shoulders relaxed, voices softened, and a pathway emerged where previously there had been none. They hadn't necessarily agreed on the specifics, but they began to see the shared foundation beneath their divergent perspectives. Outside of formal meetings, John began spending more time in quiet reflection. He found a small bench in the park where he could watch the city shift through light and shadow. The sun moving through clouds, the rustle of leaves, the way shadows stretched across empty sidewalks. All of it became a kind of meditation. He realized that understanding people wasn't about controlling them, nor about predicting their moves. It was about noticing them fully, respecting the space they needed, and engaging when the moment required. One afternoon, he returned to the bakery where he had often stopped on his morning walks. The owner greeted him with a familiar nod. Children played in the street outside, shouting and laughing. He thought about how often he had seen adults lose sight of that simplicity, rushing past the moments that grounded life. John ordered his coffee and watched quietly, making mental notes of how people moved, how they reacted to small kindnesses, how simple attention could change an entire interaction. He also began to recognize the growing weight of reputation. People spoke of him with respect, sometimes even awe, though he never sought it. Names carried weight, and names attached to him now often traveled faster than he could track. He paid careful attention to this. He corrected misunderstandings, softened exaggerations, and redirected praise when it threatened to distort the truth. He understood that identity was a living thing, something to be cultivated carefully rather than assumed. As November deepened into December, he found himself thinking about continuity and legacy, not in terms of wealth, power, or fame, but in terms of influence, presence, and stability. The threads he held weren't just his own. They belonged to a larger fabric of people, communities, and decisions intertwined. He felt the subtle responsibility of being a point where multiple threads intersected, and he accepted that this responsibility was less about action than about presence. Being steady, being consistent, being visible yet unobtrusive. Evenings often brought a different kind of clarity. Walking home beneath the dim glow of streetlights, listening to the distant hum of trains, he reflected on how change often came quietly, imperceptibly, until its effect was undeniable. He realized that his role was not to manufacture change but to steward it, to help it flow without turbulence. And in that realization came a sense of calm that had been rare in his earlier life. He began to experiment with small routines to sharpen his focus. Simple exercises. Sitting in silence before meetings, observing patterns of speech and gesture, noting how moods shifted across a room. He documented these not in a formal log but in a personal notebook, not for others to read, but to chart his own awareness. Over time, he saw patterns emerge. Moments when voices aligned, moments when silence carried more weight than words, moments when patience alone allowed resolution. There were also quieter, more personal nights. He sometimes visited old friends or family members who needed nothing more from him than companionship. They asked about mundane things, the weather, health, the quality of local bread. These conversations grounded him. They reminded him that even as his influence expanded, life's essence remained in ordinary moments, in shared laughter, in small gestures of care. Through all of this, John began to see his own evolution. He was no longer only a participant in others' conversations. He was a curator of understanding, a guide through the invisible maps of perception and expectation. People sought him not to dictate, but to illuminate the hidden connections they themselves had overlooked. And he embraced it, fully aware that such a role demanded humility, patience, and quiet courage. On one particularly cold evening, he paused at the bridge overlooking the river. The water moved steadily beneath, reflecting the golden glow of streetlights. He thought of how it didn't rush, how it adapted, how it flowed around obstacles while retaining its essence. He smiled to himself. That was the model he sought. Not to force direction, not to impose control, but to move steadily, attentively, and with purpose, shaping understanding without overstepping. And as the wind brushed against his face and the city settled into its night rhythm, John realized that he had arrived at a profound insight. The true measure of influence is not in the loudness of your voice, the decisiveness of your actions, or the sway of your power. It is in your constancy, your presence, your ability to be the calm in a sea of movement. He turned from the river and walked home, each step deliberate, aware, and steady. He carried with him not the weight of expectation, but the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that listening, presence, and patience were stronger than any command. The early winter air carried a certain clarity, sharp and clean, that John had come to welcome. He moved through the city streets with the ease of someone who knew both their rhythms and their hidden undercurrents. Each day was a layering of observation and quiet decision-making, an intricate balancing act that demanded his full attention but rewarded it with insight. In the mornings, he returned to his walks with renewed purpose. The sidewalks were quieter now, fewer people rushing, more moments to notice the subtleties of life. The sway of a tree branch against a gray sky, the measured footsteps of someone deep in thought, the murmur of a distant conversation carried by the wind. These small details, seemingly insignificant, were the fibers of understanding he relied upon. They reminded him that life's texture was woven from small, often unnoticed threads. Meetings had grown more complex. John now found himself navigating conversations that spanned multiple layers. Some practical, some abstract, and some entirely unspoken. He had learned that silence was often as important as speech, that a pause could clarify more than 1,000 words. In one meeting with several people whose interests diverged sharply, he noticed subtle signals, taps of fingers, shifts in posture, lingering glances. He didn't rush. He simply reflected what he observed back into the conversation, allowing others to recognize not just the words being spoken, but the patterns and intentions behind them. By evening, he often found himself at the local cafe, a neutral space where ordinary life carried on around him. People came and went, chatting in low tones, sipping coffee, exchanging greetings. He listened, not for gossip, but for the undercurrent of human concern. The things people didn't say outright but hinted at through tone, timing, and gesture. Understanding these nuances had become a skill he valued more than any form of authority. John's evenings were often filled with quiet reflection. He kept a notebook by his chair and wrote regularly, not to record events, but to explore his own awareness. He examined moments of tension, gestures of understanding, and the subtle shifts in group dynamics. These reflections allowed him to see patterns, predict outcomes, and, most importantly, notice where his presence could make a difference without forcing it. One particularly cold night, he walked along the river, watching the water move beneath the soft glow of city lights. The flow was steady, persistent, and yet adaptable. John found a profound lesson in its movement. Strength was not in resisting, but in knowing when to bend, when to adjust, and when to let the current guide you. He thought about the conversations he had mediated, the tensions he had observed, and the paths that had unfolded in ways he hadn't forced. Each decision he had made, each word he had spoken, had been part of a larger current that was moving steadily, if quietly, toward understanding. At home, he continued his routines. He cooked, he read, he spoke with family members about simple things. Laughter, memories, the small triumphs of daily life. These moments reminded him that influence was not about grandeur or spectacle. It was about grounding, presence, and steady attention. Even as he navigated complex networks of people and expectations, these ordinary interactions kept him anchored. John's reputation continued to grow, but he approached it with caution. He noticed how easily perception could outpace reality, how admiration or deference could turn into misunderstanding if left unchecked. He was careful to temper influence with humility, to clarify intentions without seeking praise. He knew that the strongest forms of guidance were often invisible, like the undercurrent of a river that shapes the path of the water above without drawing attention to itself. One afternoon, he walked through a neighborhood park where children played and dogs chased after sticks. He paused to watch, noting how even small shifts in energy affected the rhythm of the group. He thought about how these micro-interactions mirrored the larger dynamics he often observed in meetings and negotiations. Understanding the small details allowed him to navigate the bigger picture with greater ease. As the season deepened, he noticed that people increasingly turned to him not for answers, but for clarity. They sought someone who could hold the space for understanding, someone who could reflect their concerns without judgment, someone who could remind them of shared values when disagreements threatened to overshadow them. John accepted this role quietly, recognizing that true influence was about steadiness, not control. By the time he returned home each night, he often found the city quieter than when he had left. The streets, once busy and bustling, now seemed to hum with a gentle, reflective energy. He walked through them with care, aware of the invisible patterns that shaped life around him. And as he entered his home, he carried with him not fatigue, but the steady satisfaction of presence, a recognition that the small acts of attention, observation, and thoughtful response had a cumulative power far greater than any single command or decision. He wrote in his notebook one final time before bed, "Presence matters more than authority. Attention matters more than action. Steadiness shapes what noise cannot. Influence is the quiet current beneath life's surface, not the roar above it." As he closed the notebook, John felt the weight of the day settle into a calm, knowing awareness. The city, the people, the invisible threads connecting them all. He had begun to understand not just his place within it, but the role he could play without demanding recognition. Influence, he realized, was most powerful when it was quiet, deliberate, and consistent. And so, he rested that night, ready for the unfolding days ahead, carrying with him the steady awareness that life, like the river, moved in patterns that could be noticed, understood, and, when approached with care, guided. Winter deepened, and the city carried the hush that comes with colder months. The faint crunch of footsteps over frost-lined sidewalks, the crisp bite of air that made even familiar streets feel alive in new ways. John moved through it with the quiet attentiveness that had become second nature. His mornings began with longer walks, not merely to exercise, but to observe the rhythms of the city in their subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. The way smoke rose from chimneys, the patterns of people leaving for work, the gestures exchanged between strangers passing on the street. Each detail was a thread, and he found himself weaving them into an understanding that went beyond words. Meetings became increasingly layered. Decisions that once seemed straightforward now carried echoes, ripples that would spread far beyond the immediate circle. John had grown attuned to these patterns. He noticed when someone spoke with hesitation, when an idea sparked a small but telling smile, when tension simmered just below the surface of polite conversation. And he didn't rush to resolve these moments. Instead, he reflected them, allowing participants to see their own intentions, their own motivations with clarity. This practice became a quiet, invisible influence, one that shaped outcomes without forcing them. At a meeting one afternoon, a particularly challenging conversation arose. Two individuals with deep personal histories and conflicting priorities stood at a crossroads. Emotions ran high, but John's presence remained steady. He didn't speak first. He observed. He listened. When he finally offered his perspective, it wasn't a judgment or a decision. It was a reflection. "You both want the same thing," he said gently. "Perhaps you describe it differently, but your goal is aligned. The question isn't who is right, but how we find the bridge that allows both voices to be heard." It was a simple remark, but it shifted the room. Breaths were held less tensely. Voices softened. People began to find words that acknowledged both intention and reality. John knew the outcome would not be perfect. Few things ever were, but it would be better, stronger, more resilient. And that was enough. Outside of these formal engagements, John's personal rituals deepened. He began visiting quieter corners of the city he had once overlooked. A small cafe tucked between buildings, a library alcove with sunlight streaming through tall windows, a quiet park bench where the river reflected the city lights. These places became extensions of his practice. In them, he observed life without interference, noting how the ordinary movements of people, animals, and even the wind shaped the subtle rhythms of the world around him. Family remained a cornerstone. Even amid the complexity of his external responsibilities, he maintained moments of connection. Dinner with relatives, laughter shared over trivial memories, the comfort of shared silence. These became not just respite, but grounding. He realized that influence, patience, and presence were learned as much in these simple interactions as in the more public arenas where his attention was required. John also became aware of the weight of perception. People spoke of him in hushed tones, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with apprehension. He noted these perceptions without judgment, recognizing that reputation was a delicate construct, one that could easily become larger than reality if left unchecked. He tempered expectations with quiet humility, guiding attention back to shared objectives rather than personal recognition. One cold evening, after a day filled with layered conversations, he walked along the riverbank. The water moved steadily, reflecting the golden glow of streetlights and the pale shimmer of stars above. He reflected on how the river adapted to obstacles, how it flowed around them without losing momentum or essence. This became a metaphor for his own approach to life. Steady, adaptable, attentive, present. Challenges would arise, tensions would emerge, but the path forward was shaped by understanding, patience, and consistency rather than force. In these moments of reflection, John also began to consider legacy, not in terms of accolades or recognition, but in terms of the subtle influence one leaves on others. How each interaction, each gesture, each carefully chosen word could shape understanding and connection long after it occurred. He wrote in his notebook that night, "Legacy is not built in monuments or declarations. It is woven in the quiet spaces between actions, in the constancy of presence, in the patience to observe and respond thoughtfully." The city slept, but John remained awake in spirit, attuned to its rhythms, aware of the threads that connected him to countless unseen currents. He understood now that his role was not to dominate, nor to control, but to serve as a steady point, a presence that guided without commanding, that influenced without overshadowing, that held space for understanding to grow organically. Even as December's nights grew longer, and the cold pressed against window panes, John felt a quiet warmth. He had begun to see the invisible architecture of life, the patterns that linked individuals, communities, and moments together. He moved through this understanding with grace, patience, and deliberate attention, knowing that influence was most powerful when quiet, subtle, and consistent. And as he returned home, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows on empty sidewalks, he felt the steady assurance that his path, though layered, complex, and sometimes uncertain, was unfolding exactly as it should. He carried forward not the weight of expectation, but the calm, deliberate presence that could turn tension into understanding, uncertainty into clarity, and ordinary moments into the quiet foundation of lasting influence. As the early months of the new year arrived, the city seemed to shift almost imperceptibly. Streets that had felt quiet and reflective during winter now carried a muted energy, a sense of renewal in the air. John noticed it immediately during his morning walks, the way the first hints of sunlight softened the edges of buildings, the way people moved with slightly more purpose, the way conversations carried just a little more warmth. These subtle shifts, he realized, mirrored the internal currents he had been cultivating. Patience, observation, and steady presence beginning to ripple outward. The landscape of John's life had grown increasingly intricate. Meetings with colleagues and community members were no longer isolated events. They were part of a continuous thread, a long and interconnected conversation that required him to maintain clarity across multiple contexts. He often found himself reflecting on prior encounters before entering new ones, recalling nuances of body language, tones of voice, and fleeting expressions that might otherwise have been overlooked. Each memory became a tool for understanding, each observation a thread in the larger tapestry he was helping to weave. One afternoon, he found himself at a local community center, where he had been asked to speak about collaboration and decision-making. Not in the formal sense of lectures or advice, but in the quiet, reflective manner he had come to cultivate. He arrived early, observing as the staff moved through their routines, interacting with visitors, handling tasks with care. The subtle choreography of action and response reminded him again of the invisible patterns that governed human behavior, the ways small choices shaped larger outcomes, the ways presence and attention could ripple far beyond what was immediately visible. During the session, he spoke softly, not seeking to command attention but to guide reflection. "The work we do together," he began, "is not only about achieving results, but about understanding the currents beneath those results. Every choice we make, every response we offer, affects the patterns of connection between people. And it is in awareness of these patterns that true guidance begins." The room remained attentive, not out of obligation, but from a shared recognition of the depth beneath his words. He asked questions not to test knowledge, but to illuminate perspectives. "What do you notice when two people in disagreement suddenly find a shared point of understanding?" he asked. "How does the shift in one interaction influence the next?" As participants reflected, he realized again the subtle power of observation. Change was rarely dramatic. It was cumulative, incremental, and often invisible until its effect became undeniable. His role was not to push, not to dictate, but to hold space for awareness to emerge, and to ensure that it could expand naturally. Later, walking back through the city streets, he noticed patterns he might have missed in earlier years. A shopkeeper carefully placed a new display, anticipating the movement of pedestrians. A young couple paused, exchanging a smile that spoke more than words could capture. A stray dog trotted across the sidewalk, unnoticed by many, yet affecting the rhythm of everyone it passed. John saw these as microcosms of his broader work, small, seemingly insignificant events shaping the flow of life in ways both subtle and profound. Back home, he returned to his notebook. He wrote not to record events, but to reflect on the unseen layers of influence he had observed that day. Influence is a river. It moves quietly, touching lives in ways invisible to the eye. Each action, each pause, each gesture contributes to the flow. To guide it is not to control it, but to understand its current and to move within it deliberately. Evenings were often spent in quiet, companionship with family or close friends. These moments, seemingly ordinary, were perhaps the most essential. Laughter over shared memories, thoughtful conversations about trivial matters, and the comfort of shared presence reminded him that life's foundation lay in these small, consistent connections. Influence, patience, and observation were cultivated as much here as in the broader, more complex arenas he navigated daily. John also found time for reflection on the concept of reputation and legacy. He noticed how perceptions often traveled faster than reality, how admiration could distort understanding, and how influence could be misinterpreted if left unchecked. Rather than resisting, he approached these perceptions with care, clarifying where necessary, guiding subtly when misinterpretation threatened, and always keeping humility at the forefront of his interactions. On particularly quiet nights, he returned to the river. The water, flowing steadily under the glow of streetlights, became a mirror for his thoughts. He watched how it navigated obstacles, bending but never breaking, persisting with purpose and adaptability. John drew parallels to his own life, the steady navigation of human currents, the attentive observation of patterns, the patient guidance that influenced outcomes without force. By now, his understanding of human behavior had deepened into a near-intuitive awareness. He could sense tensions before they arose, recognize hidden alignments, and anticipate the ripple effects of small actions. Yet, he never used this insight to dominate or control. Instead, it guided him toward steadiness, patience, and quiet influence, the subtle art of shaping understanding without overshadowing it. And as he walked home one late evening, snow beginning to dust the streets in a thin, sparkling layer, John felt a calm certainty. Life, with all its complexity, was a network of interconnected currents. Each interaction, each observation, each quiet act of presence contributed to a larger, unseen pattern. And in recognizing and participating in this pattern with attention and care, he had discovered a form of influence far more profound than command or authority. He paused briefly, looking at the snowflakes dancing in the streetlight. They were fragile, fleeting, yet each played its part in shaping the landscape of the city around him. So too, he realized, were human interactions, small, delicate, yet cumulatively powerful. And in that realization came a profound sense of purpose, a commitment to continue observing, guiding, and participating in life's intricate, invisible flow. Spring arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. The gray chill of winter gave way to softer breezes, the scent of blooming flowers, and the gentle hum of life reawakening. John noticed these changes not just as background scenery but as subtle signals of transformation. A reminder that life itself was a constant, evolving current, and that patience and observation allowed one to move harmoniously within it. His days grew busier, though the rhythm remained deliberate. Meetings, discussions, and engagements now interwove like threads in a complex tapestry. John had become attuned to nuances that others might overlook: the brief flicker of hesitation, the tiny inflection in a voice, the micro-adjustments in posture when ideas were met with approval or doubt. These small details told him more than words ever could, and he relied on them to navigate complex situations with care. One afternoon, he attended a community gathering, a mix of casual conversation and shared purpose. People arrived with differing intentions, some seeking connection, some seeking validation, some seeking resolution. John did not attempt to impose direction. Instead, he observed, listened, and reflected. He encouraged dialogue, asking questions that prompted self-reflection. What would happen if you viewed the other perspective not as opposition, but as part of the same shared goal? It was a simple question, yet it shifted the energy of the room. People began to notice their own patterns, their own assumptions, and slowly conversations transformed from tension to collaboration. John understood that influence was not about dominance. It was about creating space for awareness and understanding to grow. In quieter moments, John returned to his personal rituals, walks along familiar streets, visits to overlooked corners of the city, time spent observing the rhythms of ordinary life. He paid attention to the interplay of light and shadow, the way leaves moved in the wind, the subtle gestures of passers-by. These observations were not idle. They were practice, a way to train his awareness to notice what often went unseen, to connect with life in its most intricate, delicate forms. Family remained central. Dinner conversations, shared stories, and simple laughter grounded him. He understood that the true essence of influence and understanding began at home, in these unassuming interactions. The patience, presence, and attentiveness cultivated here reinforced his approach in broader, more complex arenas. John also reflected on reputation and perception. People's impressions often moved faster than reality, and misunderstandings could easily spread. He learned to address misconceptions with subtlety, guiding perception without confrontation. Influence, he realized, was most effective when it was quiet and deliberate, a steady current rather than a sudden wave. One evening, he walked by the river again, now swollen with spring runoff, flowing faster but still gracefully around obstacles. He paused to watch the water reflect the golden hues of the setting sun. It reminded him once more that life's currents were resilient yet adaptable. Challenges, conflicts, and unexpected changes would come, but a steady, attentive presence allowed one to navigate them without losing balance. As night fell, John returned home, reflecting on the days behind him and those ahead. He wrote in his notebook, "Every interaction is a ripple, every observation, a brushstroke. Influence is not in force, but in patience and awareness. Guidance is not about control, but about creating the space for understanding to unfold naturally." He closed the notebook, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Life was complex, filled with unseen currents and intricate patterns, yet he had learned to move through it with attentiveness, empathy, and clarity. His path was not about domination or recognition, but about quietly shaping the environment through presence, subtle guidance, and consistent awareness. And as the city settled into the gentle hush of spring evening, John felt the calm certainty that his efforts, though invisible to most, were weaving threads of understanding, connection, and subtle influence into the world around him. Life, he knew, would continue in its intricate, flowing patterns, and he would continue to move within them, steady, aware, and quietly guiding where he could. The city had fully embraced spring. Trees that had once stood bare now stretched in verdant splendor, and the air carried the soft, invigorating scent of renewal. John walked through the streets with a calm awareness, noticing the tiny details he had long learned to observe. The way the sunlight refracted through glass windows, the rhythmic footsteps of children heading to school, the quiet greetings exchanged between neighbors. Everything was interconnected, a subtle network of actions and reactions, and he moved within it with ease. In these final months, John reflected on the lessons he had learned throughout his journey. Influence was not a matter of force or power, but of attentiveness, patience, and quiet presence. Understanding human behavior, recognizing unseen currents, and holding space for others to express themselves had become his guiding principles. Every decision, every conversation, every observation was a thread in a larger tapestry, and he had learned how to weave them thoughtfully, Family remained the anchor of his existence. Even amid public responsibilities and the complexity of his engagements, moments spent in laughter, shared meals, and simple conversation reinforced the values he carried into every other space. It was here that patience, empathy, and attentiveness were honed and strengthened, forming the foundation for his influence beyond the home. One late afternoon, he visited the river that had become a symbol of reflection and resilience. The water moved steadily, flowing around obstacles with grace, carrying with it both the remnants of the past and the promise of the future. John stood quietly at the edge, watching the currents twist and turn, realizing that this flow mirrored his own life. The challenges, the tensions, the unexpected events, they all had a purpose. And like the river, he had learned to navigate them with balance and calm, adapting without losing his course. In the quiet of his home that evening, he opened his notebook one last time. He reflected on the journey, not the accolades or recognition, which had never been his concern, but the subtler, enduring aspects of influence. He wrote, "Life is a network of currents, each choice a ripple. True influence is not in being seen or heard above others, but in guiding, observing, and holding space for understanding to grow. Patience, presence, and clarity. These are the tools of quiet impact. And in cultivating them, we touch lives in ways unseen yet lasting." As night fell, John sat by the window, looking out over the city lights. He thought of all the moments, large and small, that had shaped his path, the conversations that sparked insight, the gestures that connected hearts, the quiet observations that revealed truth. Everything had contributed to a life lived deliberately, attentively, and with purpose. He realized that his legacy was not built in monuments or headlines, but in the subtle influence he had woven into the lives of those around him. The calm guidance he offered, the presence he maintained, the patience with which he navigated complexity. These were the gifts he left behind. And with that understanding, John felt a profound sense of peace. The city, the river, the streets and buildings, all of it moved in its intricate, interwoven patterns, and he had moved within it with awareness and intention. His journey was complete not in fame or recognition, but in the quiet certainty that he had lived fully, consciously, and with enduring impact. As he closed his eyes that night, he carried the knowledge that life, with all its complexity and nuance, was a tapestry shaped by small, deliberate acts. And in that tapestry, he had left threads of understanding, patience, and calm guidance that would ripple outward long after. The city slept, the river flowed, and John's quiet influence remained. An invisible yet enduring presence in the intricate patterns of life he had spent a lifetime learning to understand. The story ended, not with grandeur, but with quiet fulfillment. The culmination of a life attuned to the unseen currents that connect all things. A life lived with purpose, patience, and lasting subtle impact.